Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
I mean, I'll try to give you what you want, but my internet is extremely spotty today. So let's see where we go. It's March 11th, 2022. Not even sure if you can hear me. We'll see. Negotiations have been going on in Italia between Sergei Lavrov and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Mr. Kuleba. As we go on air with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from the Great People's Dispatch with Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. As we go on the air, it looks like the Antalya process or the Turkey conversation being had between Lavrov and Kuleba have basically collapsed. Kuleba, came out of the room. He said that essentially, Lavrov was putting forward the old narrative and so on. Classical diplomatic speak. Things seems to be advancing there. Lavrov came out of the room in Antalya and said, look, everything is at the Belarus border. That's primary process. This was secondary of principal leaders. There's also a talk now in both Moscow and in Kiev of Putin speaking direct to Zelensky. Looks like the Russians are making some advance, particularly on that land bridge along the strip of land between Crimea and Russia. I suppose if they continue to make gains there, their own appetite for peace is limited. Strikingly, against UN law, both Ukraine and Russia have called mercenaries to enter the conflict. This is against UN convention that at least these countries have signed. It's pretty much a direct violation of international law to call for mercenaries. At any rate, I think it's to me at least, and we shall see how it proceeds, that if one side or the other makes gains in a conflict, the appetite for ceasefire is limited. Kuleba put on the table of having a one-day ceasefire, just 24 hours to open up humanitarian aid and so on. Looks like the Russians have basically disagreed on that. That's pretty stunning, that they haven't even agreed on a 24-hour ceasefire. There's a lot of concern about what's happening. The European Union met in Versailles, all places. France essentially called for a meeting. So we're seeing diplomacy happening in Turkey, in Belarus, or at least just across the border from Ukraine. We're seeing the possibility of a conversation between Mr. Putin, Mr. Zelensky, the principals in this conflict as well. We're seeing that the European Union much involved in trying to figure out what their combined position is. Things still remain pretty ugly in Ukraine. I mean, got a large number of refugees pouring out of the country. Still see students and others from Africa and Asia discriminated against at the border. All of that seems to continue. One of the things I've learned about war reporting is that there's a lot that becomes quite dull in the coverage. You end up covering small details like, this town is now being fought over and that town is being fought over. In the larger scheme of things, these are important. Territorial gains are important because they reflect on the appetite for peace negotiations. I think journalists, it's more important to focus on what the conversations are politically than the battlefield issues, except, of course, to report quite firmly about crimes that have been committed. In case the reports come of hospitals being bombed, so we know that the United Nations keeps track of stuff like that, and it's outrage whoever's hospital is bombed. I'd like to put it on record that even if a hospital is being run by the Nazis and bombed, that's a war crime, and it's inexcusable. No hospital should be bombed, regardless of the quote-unquote politics of the hospital. So there is now, evidence and chatter about that. Of course, sanctions on Russian businesses and so on has actually had an impact on the ability for Russian oil to come to market. This is going to be an important subject of discussion. Well, if you blocked Russian energy on the market, where are you going to recover the energy from? Probably Iran. Talk about easing up on the Iran sanctions. Stunningly, out of nowhere almost, talk of easing up on the hybrid pressure on Venezuela. Zoe, high-level U.S. delegation goes to Caracas. Was this coincidence? Has it to do with the Russian intervention into Ukraine? What did Nicolas Maduro do with the Americans that showed up in Caracas?
Well, it was quite interesting news that came out on Saturday. A New York Times story came out that a high-level delegation, as you mentioned, from the United States traveled to Caracas. And interestingly enough, the New York Times, which has often, since 2019, calling Juan Guaido the interim president, actually called Nicolas Maduro the president of Venezuela. So interesting shift in narrative there as well. And they traveled to Venezuela on Saturday, held some meetings. Clearly, there were negotiations that went on. And I say clearly because immediately following this meeting, the president, Nicolas Maduro, made several announcements. One being that the dialogue process between the Venezuelan government and the far-right opposition will be restarted. This dialogue process was suspended in the fall last year because of the extradition of Alex Saab, who is a diplomatic envoy of the Venezuelan government. He was extradited to the United States, and swiftly after the Venezuelan government suspended these talks that had been going on with the opposition, the following day, two prisoners of American nationality or passports were released in Venezuela. One was a Citgo executive. One was a Cuban American that had been accused of operating a drone in a terrorist attack. So these two moves by the Venezuelan government clearly show that there has been some level of conversations, and it is directly linked to the U.S. complete ban on imports of Russian energy. If you all of a sudden cut off your main energy supplier of gas, of oil, it's not that you don't have that same need. Where are you going to get it from? And so the U.S. is looking to their natural ally in oil production for many, many years, which is Venezuela. Even after the Bolivarian Revolution and after U.S. oil companies had been, appropriated by the Venezuelan state, there was still a lot of exchange between the two countries. Citgo is one of the largest subsidiaries of the PDVSA oil company and is located in the United States. So it will be interesting. One key thing to point out on this topic of sanctions is that Venezuelan oil sector has suffered enormous losses because of these sanctions, because of course, the seizure of Citgo, but also because of the sanctions, they were not able to import the necessary parts to repair their oil infrastructure. So production not only dropped because they weren't able to export in the same way they were before, but also because they didn't have the infrastructure to be able to process and produce this oil. So if this is true, and if the United States is going to lift sanctions, if they're going to start trying to get oil from Venezuela, there is going to be a process of rehabilitating all of this infrastructure that Venezuela does have. There were advances made with Iran. Iran heroically, during the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, sent a team of engineers to help try to repair some of this, the refinery infrastructure, and made really important gains. But again, this oil infrastructure is not at the level it needs to be able to produce the amount that the United States would be wanting to buy at this moment. So I think this is a very interesting shift. Will the pressure be lessened on Venezuela? Some people are questioning whether the very strong links between Venezuela and Russia are going to be weakened. That doesn't seem to be the case. There was a high-level meeting between Delcy Rodriguez and I think Lavrov in Turkey as well. So hopefully there will be lessening of sanctions, because that has, as we know, led to not only the death of over 100,000 people in Venezuela, but caused so many so much destruction to the economy, to the social life, to the political life. It is a welcome change, and hopefully it will, better the conditions of the Venezuelan people.
Well, generally, that is a priority, that the people's livelihood and conditions be improved. This week, we lost an important voice, Ajaz Ahmed, an important Marxist intellectual, a good friend of People's Dispatch, used to watch this show almost a week and would send comments on it occasionally. Ajaz Ahmed, the last period of his life, the author of In Theory and Lineage of the Present and on, was working on the growth of far-right forces, not just in the heart of Europe and in North America, but in around the rest of the world. We had an election in South Korea, very chilling character, incoming President Yoon. I'm sure Prashant has got a lot to tell us about President Yoon, but this is exactly the figure that Ajaz Ahmed was looking at, somebody who, well, Prashant, tell us about the South Korean election.
Right, Vijay. Also, speaking of right-wing figures winning elections, we had elections in states in India yesterday. The right-wing BJP winning some victories. Pretty difficult times for democracy ahead in India as well. But again, South Korea, very fascinating contest in many ways that just took place recently. That was on March 9th. 40 million people voted. Very close contest. The actual result was decided by less than 1%. And we have the People's Power Party's Yoon Seok Yeol, who's become the next president. And very curious character, like you said, because he's actually a bit of a political novice. He was, I think he failed a couple of times to get into the bar, then became a lawyer, ended up as a prosecutor in the previous Moon Jae-in government. He's been taking a lot of positions which are your standard, right-wing boilerplate positions at this point of time across the world, calling for a very harsh stand on immigration. There's a lot of xenophobia on it. There's a lot of stigmatization of many people who are, immigrant workers who are working on that. I think he's called them parasites on the national healthcare system, if I'm not mistaken. Advocating, of course, a classic free market approach in general. He's proposed creating exceptions to the reduction in working hours. One of his more controversial statements was calling for the abolition of a Ministry of Gender, Equality and Family. And he's also made some very offensive comments about African people that his own party criticized. So that's your boiler in some senses. From a global perspective, I mean, there is a lot of domestic specificities as well. But in some case, from a global perspective, if you look at the patterns of process, he in some ways fits that mantle of a right-wing candidate and has come to power. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately not because of anything else, but the fact that right now the Koreas are a very key place in terms of international peace as well. And the prospect, one good thing about the previous Moon Jae-in administration was that as President Moon Jae-in specifically tried to not just kickstart, but actually take the peace process with North Korea forward. There was quite a bit of discussion that took place. It's quite fascinating that this happened during the time of Donald Trump, which you would not assume was likely to happen. But I think Moon Jae-in brought a lot to the table there as an interlocutor, someone considering how in some senses South Korea has often been a subsidiary ally of the United States. The fact that he was able to, use some of those relations and strike a balance between the imperialist ambitions of the United States, the massive bases there. And at the same time, the push for peace was very good. But what we see with this character is basically somebody who has been arguing for a very hardline stance on this. He's called for further joint military exercises. He's called for deployment of anti-missile systems. I believe he's even advocated a preemptive strike. So we might be seeing many steps backwards as far as the peace process is concerned. And we have, of course, the very hawkish Joe Biden administration in the United States, whom encircling China is such a major priority. So at this point of time, it's a big question what happens when a leader like this becomes the president of a country like South Korea, which has a key role to play in this entire region and this entire process. So we need to see what lies ahead, but tough times, I think, for those who are resisting the right.
in other words, incoming President Yoon has also called a renuclearization of the South Korea, at least. Can you imagine, given what's happening in Ukraine, where the issue is really also forward deployment of intermediate missiles, to even consider nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula seems extraordinarily terrifying as a prospect. Listening to Give the People What Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Joey and Prashad. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Well, that's that, right? And here comes the question of China. Renuclearization of the South Korea means China. Question of China. Argentina recently signed a agreement to become part of the Belt and Road Initiative of China, somewhere straddling between an IMF loan and the Belt and Road. News coming out of Argentina about one of the coalition partners in the government and its relationship with the IMF loan. So what is Patria Grande up to regarding the IMF loan and the government of Mr. Alberto Fernandez?
Well, actually, this morning at about 4 a.m, Argentina, the IMF agreement that was proposed by the Alberto Fernandez government of Frente de Todos was actually defeated in the Congress. And this is quite significant because this is an agreement that had been kind of hanging over the government of Alberto Fernandez essentially since he took office. As you mentioned, Mauricio Macri took out a huge, very, very controversial loan with the IMF. For the Argentinian people, the IMF has a very sordid history in the country. It has caused immense suffering, has been the sole contributor to the worst economic crises the country has suffered through in the early 2000s. Thousands of people without work, their currency devalued. This has happened again with the IMF agreement in 2017, 2018 that Macri took out. And ahead of this voting, the Frente Patria Grande, which is part of the ruling coalition of Frente de Todos, released a statement, held a press conference, and saying that their deputies would not support, they would not vote in favor of this agreement. And essentially, it's quite a long document, and I think it's quite important to highlight some of the different aspects of it because it really speaks to of course, why they're opposing it, but what does it mean for the people of the country to pay for a loan that not only was unpopular amongst the people, but also only benefited large capitalists in the country. And in many cases, a lot of the money that came from the IMF loan actually was shown to have left the country. Argentina has a sort of a complicated situation in terms of the structure of their economy. They're huge soy producers. There's a tendency in their economy for a lot of the people to allow the currency to devaluate and then change it for dollars and make it more for their soy exportation. And this happened a lot. The Juan Graboy actually brought a complaint to the Senate asking for the Senate to investigate how this sector it's called the fleeing of dollars from the economy. And so they highlighted this. They say the people will not pay for this debt. They highlight that there's 15,000 people who are poor, 15 million people who are poor, 5 million people who are in a state of homelessness or near homelessness. A really challenging situation for the Argentinian people. And in the middle of this, they are now going to have to pay for the debt that was created by Mauricio Macri and his, and the economic elites in the country. And so they voted against this agreement. And not only them, but many other sections of the Congress. The agreement was defeated. And then once again, the question remains, how is this agreement to be dealt with? For Frente Patria Grande, they say this agreement should be paid for by those that benefited from it, that the people should not pay. This agreement is inhumane. It's shouldn't, go forward. It's a political deadlock because on one level, the government does have this sort of obligation to this what they call colonial structure of the IMF. If they default on the loan, what is going to be the impact on Argentina's ability to engage in global financial markets? I think the question of sanctions, the question of the power of international financial institutions, a really big question of our time. It's being faced by countries across the world. And so it is, an existential question. But as you mentioned, Argentina is growing other economic relationships based on equality, based on just exchange, like the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I think we'll see what happens if there's going to be there will have to be a new version of this agreement. Will they actually take this task forward of investigating those who left the country with the dollars, those who benefited from this loan, and those who left the people to suffer? That remains to be seen.
Those who left the people to suffer. That's actually a good way to segue into our next story from South Africa, because South Africa ends its freedom from apartheid in 1994, then struggles with what could only be called economic apartheid. The shack dwellers movement, part of the big struggle to bring on the table the question of this economic apartheid. Prasanth, it's not been easy for the shack dweller or for anybody trying to push a people-centered agenda. What's been happening in Durban, the epicenter of the current conflict?
Right, Vijay, a very tragic incident took place this week. We are referring, of course, to the assassination of Ayanda Ngila, who was the deputy chairperson of the Ekhanana occupation of Abahlali baseMjondolo, a young 29-year-old man, already been to jail twice for the cause of his movement. And the recent Abahlali baseMjondolo statement, that's the Shack Dwellers movement, mentions that while he was assassinated, he was wearing a Steve Biko t-shirt which said that it's better to die for an idea that is going to live than to live for an idea that is going to die. And he was one of the many people, many members of Abahlali baseMjondolo who have, fought the state and what the state has been since 1994. And I think there are multiple things we need to talk of while talking about this case. One was the fact that the assassin, or who's the person believed to be the lead gunman in his assassination, is actually the son of a leading African National Congress functionary. The same person was involved in an attack on the Ekhanana occupation on March 6th, that is Sunday, that is just 2 days before the assassination. A police case was filed against him. He was not arrested. And the day after, he was reportedly involved in this assassination. So that itself, I think, is, a lot of people have pointed out that if the police had taken action against this person, the life of a young activist could have been saved. And this in some ways is very emblematic, I think, of how the South African state and the South African institutions have treated Abahlali baseMjondolo. There seems to be some kind of outrage that people who are marginalized do not refuse to be clients. There seems to be outrage that people who are marginalized refuse to say that refuse to say, okay, just give us something, we'll survive. Because the operational principle of Abahlali baseMjondolo has been of self-reliance, has been of assertion, has been of people saying that, we are not going to take what circumstances we have been given, even if the state does not do its job, even if the government does not provide what it should provide us by right, we will take those rights. And that is the powerful symbolism of the land occupations of this movement. They have built, houses out of scratch, despite there being no kind of facilities provided to them. They have set up, they've grown vegetables, they've grown poultry, they have a political education school. So Abahlali baseMjondolo is one of the most significant movements across the world, actually, because it brings a completely different perspective into the question of urban politics. It provides a completely revolutionary perspective on how to look at this. And it is for this reason that its members have been constantly targeted. They've been accused of, the standard accusation is public nuisance. They've been accused of murder. They've been put in jail. Many of these cases have collapsed because the evidence has been absent or completely forged. And as a last resort, in many cases, their members have been assassinated. So very horrible tragedy. And I think, but nonetheless, they have reiterated that their struggle will go on. And I think across the world, it's very important that people know the story of Ayanda Ngila and all of his comrades who are actually fighting this very powerful struggle.
That's a story from Durban, South Africa. I should say that the school that Abahlali runs is the Frans Fanon Liberation School, very well named school. Well, it's a sunny day today in Santiago in Chile. Next year, the Chilean people will commemorate one way or the other the 50th anniversary of the coup d'etat against Salvador Allende. Next year, it will be 50 years since that coup d'etat. Today, the country had a new president, Gabriel Boric Font, aged 36. He wasn't born when that coup took place. Mr. Boric, the youngest president in Chile's history, is a person of the center left perhaps, but more center than center left. An important figure in the student movement of 2011. Somebody who was part of the kind of frustration about the pressure brought to bear against students and others as a consequence of the Pinochet era, neoliberalism policies. He has promised to reverse these policies, but I think the space for maneuver for Mr. Boric pretty limited. He has turned essentially to the new constitution process, which is writing a constitution for the first time since the Pinochet era constitution of 1980. It will be voted on next year. That perhaps is going to be one of the most important elections that this country of 7 million people has seen, to actually vote in a new constitution. Mr. Boric is immediately going to face some important challenges. For instance, there is a struggle ongoing in the south of Chile, from which Mr. Boric hails. He comes from one of the most southernmost provinces of Chile. There is a big struggle between the Mapuche people and the Chilean state. There's been an emergency decree against the struggles in this region. Not clear that Mr. Boric's government will withdraw that emergency decree. Looks like they might keep it in place. That's one challenge. The second challenge is a big migration challenge in the north of the country, where there's large deposits of lithium. These are migrants coming to Chile from various parts of Latin America, but including Venezuela. Because of the harsh sanctions regime in Venezuela, large number of people left the country. Previous president Sebastián Piñera welcomed people from Venezuela into the country. They came in and they've been very much mistreated inside Chile. Not clear again what Mr. Boric will do. Mr. Boric, in terms of foreign policy or international relations, has already set himself in a very interesting place, attacked the governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. In fact, it's interesting. Today is his inauguration. He's already been inaugurated in Valparaiso by the Congress. But for that inauguration, Mr. Boric did not invite the governments of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. This is interesting because even the right-wing government of Sebastián Piñera did invite them. It's a very significant issue. Having not invited these governments, I'm not sure what his policy is going to be regarding the immigration and the crisis in the north. Nonetheless, a lot of symbolic gestures are already apparent. It's the first majority cabinet, majority women cabinet in Chile. I believe, therefore, in Latin America, might even be the first majority cabinet in the world, but I'm not sure about that. Certainly, Mr. Boric is one of the youngest heads of government in the world at age 36. He turned 36 last month. Also, extraordinarily savvy in terms of social measures and social movements, social transformations. This is not government. It's going to look like the government of the right or even of the center. It's going to be a very savvy government. There are 3 members of the Communist Party in it and so on. But friends, on economic policy, on foreign policy, I think they will drift more into the general orientation put out by the United States. It's got to be said that in Chile, China-Chilean trade is 3 times as large as Chilean-US trade. It is, in fact, probably going to be the pressure that comes from the commercial side that might moderate Chile's pro-US tilt, which has been there since 1973. All things we'll continue to cover. It's a beautiful day again today. People are breathing a sigh of relief that Sebastian Pinera is gone. People will breathe a deeper sigh of relief on the 50th anniversary of the coup, very symbolic year when a new constitution will be voted into place. You've been listening to Give the People What They Want, coming from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, come every Friday. I hope you've had at least moderately good time with us. All the stories have been great. We've lost a lot of people this week, some old, some young. It's also the anniversary of when the pandemic was declared. Hope the all clear will be whistled soon from the headquarters of the World Health Organization. See you next week.